The gathering of the world's most powerful democracies is meant to be a symbol of unity. It's a forum where common challenges are met with a common front. Yet the 2025 G7 summit in the serene setting of Kananaskis, Alberta, was marked not by consensus, but by a conspicuous absence. US President Donald Trump departed the summit a full day early on the evening of Monday, June 16, 2025. His leaving was sudden, disrupting the carefully planned schedule and leaving his counterparts to grapple with major global crises without the leader of the world's foremost economic and military power. This was more than just a scheduling conflict. It was a potent symbol of a shifting world order, one where America's commitment to traditional alliances is no longer a given. President Trump's justification for his early exit was brief and characteristically direct. "I have to be back, very important," he stated, offering little further explanation. This decision meant he would miss crucial Tuesday sessions dedicated to the ongoing war in Ukraine and complex global trade issues. The optics were stark, as the leaders of Canada, the UK, France, Germany, Italy and Japan prepared to meet with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. The American chair sat empty. The departure signaled a clear divergence in priorities, suggesting that the long-standing issues occupying the minds of America's allies were secondary to other, unspecified matters demanding the president's attention back in Washington. It was a move that spoke volumes about his administration's focus. The implications of this action rippled through the diplomatic world almost immediately. International summits are built on protocol and presence. A leader's attendance signifies engagement and a willingness to participate in collective problem-solving. By leaving prematurely, President Trump sent an unmistakable message that the G7, as a forum, held diminished importance for his administration. He was scheduled to hold bilateral meetings with both President Zelensky of Ukraine and Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum. These cancellations were not just logistical inconveniences, they were perceived as diplomatic snubs that undermined the very purpose of such high-level gatherings, leaving allies to question the reliability of American leadership on the world stage. This act cannot be viewed in isolation. It is part of a broader pattern of behavior that has defined Trump's approach to international relations. His America First doctrine has consistently challenged the post-war liberal international order that America itself helped to build. The G7, once a platform for coordinating Western policy, has increasingly become a stage for highlighting the deep divisions between the United States and its closest partners. Trump's early exit was not just a departure from a summit. It was a physical manifestation of a deeper ideological departure from the principles of multilateralism that have guided Western foreign policy for decades. The remaining leaders were left to project an image of unity that felt hollowed out. The G7 summit's planned agenda was thoroughly derailed by a far more volatile and immediate crisis: the escalating conflict between Israel and Iran. The situation had reached a boiling point just days before the leaders convened. Israel had launched a significant aerial bombardment campaign against Iran on Friday, and Iran had swiftly retaliated with its own barrage of missiles and drones. This direct military exchange between the two regional powers overshadowed every other discussion, forcing the G7 to confront the spectre of a full-blown war in the Middle East. The tranquil Canadian mountains provided a surreal backdrop for discussions of missile strikes and potential nuclear escalation, a stark reminder of the fragility of global peace. President Trump's focus was clearly fixed on this conflict. Before his departure, he issued a stern warning to Tehran, demanding that Iran curb its nuclear program before it's too late. He had previously set a 60-day deadline for an agreement to be reached before the Israeli assault began, a timeline that had now expired with explosive consequences. While Trump did join the other G7 leaders in a joint statement affirming that Iran can never have a nuclear weapon and calling for de-escalation, his own rhetoric was far more inflammatory. His actions created a confusing dual-track message, one of collective diplomacy and another of unilateral threat, leaving the world to wonder which was the true American policy. The ambiguity of the US position was highlighted by a startling social media post from the president on Monday afternoon. Everyone should immediately evacuate Tehran, he wrote, a message that sent shockwaves through international markets and diplomatic channels. This was not the language of careful de-escalation. When pressed by reporters earlier about what might trigger direct US military involvement, Trump was evasive, replying, "I don't want to talk about that." This combination of alarming public warnings and private ambiguity created a climate of intense uncertainty. It was unclear if the president was preparing for war, engaging in a high-stakes bluff, or simply speaking impulsively on the world stage. The other G7 leaders found themselves in a difficult position. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, for instance, emphasized the need for a unified stance, stating that Germany was working on a final communiqué that would stress Iran must under no circumstances be allowed to acquire nuclear weapons-capable material. Yet this shared goal was complicated by Trump's unpredictable approach. The leaders were attempting to build a diplomatic off-ramp and contain the conflict, but the actions and words of the US president seemed to be pointing in a different, more confrontational direction. The crisis in the Middle East thus served to expose not only the dangers of the conflict itself, but also the deep fissures within the Western alliance. Beyond the immediate crisis in the Middle East, the G7 summit revealed profound and seemingly intractable divisions over the war in Ukraine. President Trump's perspective on Russia's role in the world stands in stark contrast to that of his European and Canadian counterparts. He has repeatedly suggested that the conflict might have been avoided if Russia had not been expelled from the group, then the G8, following its annexation of Crimea in 2014. This view fundamentally questions the unified Western response to Russian aggression, treating it as a strategic blunder rather than a necessary stand for international law. His approach recasts Russia not as an adversary to be isolated, but as a potential partner whose exclusion was a mistake. The differing views on how to handle Russia manifested in concrete policy disagreements. As the G7 leaders who remained in Kananaskis met with Ukrainian President Zelensky, they discussed further measures to support Kyiv and penalize Moscow. Britain's Prime Minister Keir Starmer took the lead, announcing a new slate of G7 tariffs targeting Russia. However, President Trump had already made it clear that the United States would not be joining this initiative. He stated he would prefer to wait for Europe to act first, a position that effectively grants a US veto over collective action and breaks the united front that has been crucial for maintaining pressure on the Kremlin. This reluctance to lead from the front further isolates America from its allies. The Kremlin, for its part, watched these divisions with satisfaction. Spokesman Dmitry Peskov dismissed the G7 summit as pale and quite useless, suggesting that more inclusive forums like the G20, which includes Russia and China, are the true centers of global power. This narrative is significantly strengthened when the G7 itself appears fractured and incapable of unified action. Trump's skepticism toward the group's purpose and his unwillingness to align with its consensus on Russia played directly into Moscow's strategic goal of weakening Western institutions and alliances. The image of a divided G7 is a powerful propaganda victory for Russia, undermining the very notion of a cohesive democratic bloc. The Tuesday meetings, held in Trump's absence, carried a sense of both defiance and diminished capacity. The presence of President Zelensky and NATO chief Mark Rutte was intended to show unwavering support for Ukraine. The leaders from the UK, Canada, France, Germany, Italy and Japan continued their work. But the reality was that any major initiative would lack the full weight of the United States. They could pledge support and coordinate sanctions, but the absence of the world's largest economy and military power fundamentally limited the impact of their decisions. The summit thus became a showcase of a G6+1, a group of allies trying to hold the line while their most powerful member charted a different course. President Trump's disruptive approach is not limited to security alliances. It is most pronounced in the realm of international trade. He has fully embraced his identity as the tariff man, implementing aggressive protectionist policies that have shaken the foundations of the global trading system. His administration has imposed steep tariffs, 50% on steel and aluminum, 25% on automobiles, and a sweeping 10% tax on most other imports. These are not targeted measures, but broad-based assaults on the principle of free trade that has been a cornerstone of American-led globalization for decades. This stance transforms allies into economic competitors, creating friction and inviting retaliation. At the G7, these trade tensions were palpable. While President Trump did sign a trade framework with UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, a deal that had been announced back in May, it was an exception to the general trend of conflict. The broader tariff structure remains a major point of contention with the European Union, Canada and Japan. Trump has threatened to increase the general tariff rate even further after a 90-day negotiating period expires on July 9th, holding the prospect of a full-blown trade war over the heads of America's partners. This strategy of using tariffs as a primary tool of foreign policy creates an environment of instability, making it difficult for businesses and governments to plan for the future. The America First trade policy is rooted in a belief that the United States has been taken advantage of by unfair international agreements for too long. From this perspective, multilateral organizations like the World Trade Organization and agreements like the G7 communiques are seen as constraints on American sovereignty and economic power. By imposing unilateral tariffs, President Trump seeks to rebalance these relationships on his own terms, forcing other countries to negotiate bilaterally with the United States, while the stated goal is to protect American jobs and industries. The strategy risks fracturing the global economy into competing blocs and dismantling the very system that facilitated decades of unprecedented global prosperity. The early departure from the G7 summit is the logical conclusion of this worldview. If international gatherings are seen primarily as venues where other nations try to constrain the United States, then attending them becomes less of a priority. The future of the G7 and similar institutions in this environment is uncertain. They may continue to meet, but their relevance will be diminished if they cannot count on the full participation and commitment of their most powerful member. The drama in Kananaskis was more than a fleeting diplomatic spat. It was a clear signal that the world is moving into a new, more contentious era of international relations, one defined by transactional diplomacy and the erosion of long-standing alliances.